All right, week 20 of the Power Rankings and the last ones before the trade deadline. Which, to be clear, I'm not going to move teams up or down when the trade deadline comes just because of players they acquired or lost. They do actually have to play better after acquiring those players to see that reflected in these Power Rankings. Because, as we've seen just about every year, there's usually one or two teams that make some acquisitions that don't really end up helping them. Now, before we jump right into these Power Rankings, yes, it is the same top 10 teams as I had last week. I just couldn't really talk my way into any of the teams that were towards the bubble of the top 10 having played bad enough to work their way out. That having been said, things have gotten shuffled around quite a bit since last week's Power Rankings. There are a couple teams I don't really feel like I had in the right spot last week after the 1 week hiatus, so that's been corrected, and there was quite a shuffle between some teams at the top that have not been playing well and some teams in the middle that have been playing pretty well of late. That having been said, the one team that is new to this video is one of the honorable mentions in the Nashville Predators. Now, the Predators have 8 straight wins, I think it is now, and have been playing fantastic over that span, really rocketing themselves into a pretty healthy spot as one of the 2 wildcard teams in the West. Now, they still have to keep things going as there are a clump of teams chasing them that I think all have games in hand on them, but it's been a pretty impressive run, and now they have about a week or 2 of an easier schedule that should help them maintain that lead. Even with that being said, though, if there was a team that would have in the 11th spot and right on the bubble of this top 10, it would be the same team as last week, in spite of 2 losses in their last 2 games, so back-to-back losses they're coming off of, including a shutout at the hands of the Florida Panthers. The Detroit Red Wings are still a team that's playing well enough that they could work their way into this top 10 with a good week, and one of the teams towards the bottom struggling enough to find their way out. And if that were to happen, it really could come from any one of the first 4, maybe 5 teams that I'm going to mention on this list, as anywhere from 10 to 7, I could be talked into shuffling around. I mean, it really did come down to splitting hairs between these teams, and wasn't helped out by the fact that they're all kind of here for different reasons, and have been headed in different directions over the last couple weeks. But we start out in the 10th spot with the Colorado Avalanche, a team that I'm not terribly convinced are going to stay in the 10th spot, not because I think they'll drop out, but more because I think this is a team that, especially as we get through the last stretch of games, is going to start playing more and more playoff hockey to get in that mindset come the postseason, and we'll see them move their way up the list. That having been said, they have to consistently show an ability to do that, which has been a problem for them pretty much all season long and remains so this week, as they started out the week strong with an impressive 5-1 win over a good Stars team that we still will end up seeing on this list, and then followed it up with a 5-0 shutout of the Blackhawks that, I mean, it's an impressive win, I guess, but it's the Blackhawks, so how much can you really take out of that? And then they finish out their week with a 5-1 loss to the Predators. So in a lot of ways, it was like their season, that it was an up and down week with more ups than downs, but it still leaves you with some questions by the end of it. Then up next in the 9th spot, we have one of our big movers of the week, and not in a good way, as it is the Boston Bruins, who have spent this entire season in the top 5, I'm pretty sure, so this is by far the lowest they've been on this list, and that is kind of a correction at this point to just accepting that the Bruins are not playing very well. They've lost 9 of their last 13 games, and sure, 5 of those are in overtime as they spent 6 straight games going to overtime, so well sure, they do get 5 loser points out of more than half of those 9 losses. It still doesn't inspire confidence going into the last month plus of the season, and then the postseason, where it doesn't matter whether you lose in overtime or regulation, a loss is a loss. Plus, if you're going to qualify half of those losses by the fact that they went to overtime, half of those 4 wins also happened in overtime, so it's just not a team that's playing convincing hockey at this point in time, and certainly not worthy of staying in the top 5, even though they did have that incredible start to, well, not even start to the season, first 2/3 of their season. And at the 8th spot, we have another team that's dropped quite a ways from last week, and farther down than they've been in quite a while, in the Vancouver Canucks, who, like the Bruins, have been struggling pretty consistently over the last few weeks, and to take the same snapshot of the last 13 games, while they have won more than the Bruins, they've won 5 of their last 13, they've still lost 8, and only 2 of those losses came in overtime. Well, again, 2 of the wins also came in overtime. Part of the reason I have them above the Bruins is because one of those overtime wins was recently against the Bruins at the end of last week, but it's been a pretty rough stretch here for the Canucks over the last few weeks, and while they did have that incredible season to get them to the point where they're still leading the Pacific with a bit of a buffer, Again, it has to be a bit concerning that things are starting to unravel a little bit here, coming down the stretch right when you don't want them to, and especially considering this team, unlike a lot of the others, has already made a couple of key additions via trade, both from the Flames in Zadorov and Lindholm. Which, by the way, while we're on that subject, neither one of them has been especially fantastic for the Canucks since acquiring them. Now, Zadorov, they didn't give quite as much up, and he has a little bit more of a role player on the defensive end than what they were expecting out of Lindholm, but especially Lindholm in just 14 games has only 6 points with 4 goals and 2 assists. And considering the time on ice that he's getting and how much they gave up to get him, I think they would have expected quite a bit more, and even for what it's worth, I still think Zadorov has been underperforming in the 36 games that he's played. Now, with all that being said, it's not time to panic for either one of these teams, the Bruins or Canucks. Both of them are going to have no trouble making the playoffs, and could still, either one of them, end up winning their divisions. But it is a concerning trend here of late as we go down this last stretch, and might at least be worth putting a pause on planning any parades. Moving on though, we have a team that's headed not only in a very different direction from the last two teams we just talked about, but also from where they were this time last week in the Edmonton Oilers. Now, the Oilers last week were in the 10th spot and trending outside the top 10. If they had kept going the way they were, they definitely would have ended up outside of it, and we could have had the discussion about the Red Wings being in the 10th spot, but instead they went 4 for 4 on the week with 4 wins, 1 in overtime, but 3 wins in regulation, plus the overtime win against the Blues. And I think it's worth pointing out that with these 4 wins they had this week, if you watch the power rankings from last week, I pointed out how the 10 games following their 16-game winning streak, they had started to relapse into being the Oilers we're used to, not particularly great on defense, and shaky in net. Or at the very least, they were certainly giving up more goals than they did at any point during that 16-game winning streak. And how over these last 4 this week, they went back to how they were playing during that winning streak, giving up 1 or 2 goals per game and finding ways to win games even when they weren't necessarily playing at their best. Like in the game, or certainly the first period of the game against Seattle, where they end up winning that game 2-1 in spite of a tough start defensively to that game. They are able to overcome that thanks to some strong goaltending from Skinner and still find a way to win that game, which over the 10 games leading into this week, they'd kind of found ways to lose games more often than not. And on top of all that, as well as McDavid's bid for 100 assists on the season, with the Canucks being the last team I talked about, it's probably worth mentioning that while the Oilers still are 11 points behind the Canucks in the standings, they do have 5 games in hand, and if they keep playing the way they have over these last 4, again, like that long winning streak they already went on, they could theoretically end up getting right up to the Canucks and potentially even catching them with the way the Canucks have been trending of late. Then in the 6th spot, I have another team that started to turn things back in the right direction here over the last week in the Dallas Stars. Now, for the Stars, it hasn't been quite as quick of a 180 turn like what the Oilers did this week, but they still have started to right the ship a little bit and got 2 wins in their last 2 games. That being said, it was an overtime win against the Sharks, which is not a team they should probably have to go to overtime to beat, but they did win 4-1 over the Jets, which based on how the Jets are playing lately is a pretty impressive win, even if it was coming off of a 5-1 loss to start their week to the Avalanche. Which, because of that loss, I'm sure there are going to be some Avalanche fans in the comments wondering how I can have the Avalanche in 10th, 4 places below the Stars up here in 6th, after having beaten them early on this week 5-1. And all I can really say to that is, well, 1, I did say that the bottom 5 teams in this power rankings I could really be convinced to move around to any other spots. They're all headed in different directions, playing differently at different points in time. It's just a jumbled mess, and I think they're all pretty close to each other in different ways. Again, it came down to splitting hairs between 6th and 10th on this list, so while it does seem like a big gap being 10th to 6th, in my mind, there really isn't that big of a gap between these 5 teams. And I'm sure probably part of that splitting hairs was that between the two, the Stars did finish out their week with the 2 wins, where the Avalanche finished out their week getting blown out by the Predators. Not to mention that there's probably some amount of me that, being an ex-Avalanche fan, I hold the Avalanche to a bit of a higher standard than the Stars, so their inconsistent play maybe plays a little bit heavier in my mind in a negative way than it does for the Stars. Anyway, all that to say, these 5 teams are all very close to each other and could easily move to anywhere within this top 5 without too much trouble come this time next week, and given a good week, could definitely jump up into the top 5, and that includes the Avalanche. Moving on then into that top 5, I have in the 5th spot the Carolina Hurricanes, who were just a 3rd period in their last game of the week against the Jets, away from being maybe higher on this list and having a very impressive 3-0 week. Unfortunately, they did have a horrendous 3rd period in that game, blowing a 3-0 lead to end up losing that one 5-3, giving up 5 goals in the 3rd. One of them's an empty netter, but still a a tough third period there for the Canes. Even still though, aside from not being able to close out the Jets and that terrible last 20 minutes, they did have a pretty good week with 2 wins to start it out against the Wild and Blue Jackets. Obviously the Blue Jackets they should have no trouble beating anyway, but they give up just 2 goals in each of those games and then start out the game against a very good Jets team in a way that you usually would win games. Unfortunately, the goaltending kind of came back to bite them in that third period, and that will be the question mark with this team going all the way into the postseason, which again, as it feels like I say every week, has kind of been the story with this team all season long, at least from an outsider perspective anyway. They really do seem to live and die by their goaltending more so than any other team. If their goaltending isn't playing well, they are pretty aggressively mid, but if they are getting goaltending, this is one of the hardest teams in the NHL to beat, which does make this team pretty hard to pin down, especially considering that is always one of the biggest wild cards with any team, especially when you go into the playoffs, where you can have a goaltender that has a Vezina-style season and then just doesn't really show up and the team loses in the first round. Or you can have a goaltender that hardly played even in the regular season or wasn't that great, and they end up going on a crazy run and winning their team a Stanley Cup, like Adin Hill last year, for example. And who knows, maybe with that volatility of their goaltending in mind and how much it seems to affect the performance of the team, maybe that's something they will try to address here at the trade deadline. But if they don't, this could be a team that I could easily see going out in the first round in 5, maybe 6 games, or going all the way to a cup final. Speaking of goaltending questions and getting knocked out in the first round of the playoffs, in the 4th spot I have the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, yes, I know that's not totally fair. They did get knocked out in the second round last year for the first time in a long time, and their goaltending is back to being, well, mostly healthy at least. Woll finally makes his return, but this is a team that, to the chagrin of many, has been playing very well over the last few weeks, winners of 9 of their last 10, and some pretty good opponents in that stretch. The only game they lost is a team that they also beat within that stretch, in the Vegas Golden Knights, who do beat them 6-2 to start out the week, but then they come back with back-to-back wins over the Arizona Coyotes, which doesn't sound like that impressive of a win considering how things have been going for the Coyotes of late, but it is a team that they hadn't beat at home in regulation in over 20 years, so they're able to overcome that demon and then beat the Rangers in overtime. Now, obviously, as everyone's probably well aware because of how much this team gets covered, aside from the return of Woll, the big story here is Austin Matthews' bid at 70 goals on the season, which does seem well within reach based on how things have been going for him this season and how easily he seems to be finding the back of the net. And of course, if he gets there, you'd have to like his chances to win the Hart. Though personally, at least right now, I'd still take McKinnon over Matthews, but that's a discussion for a different time. Still, aside from everything Matthews been able to do for them, maybe the most encouraging thing from a Leaf fan standpoint is that it's not really all on Matthews, or hasn't been over this last stretch of games, as they've been getting contributions from all sorts of different places in the lineup over this stretch in any different game. Bertuzzi had a hat trick, Nyes has been playing well, Domi's had some good games here and there, Nylander's having a great season that's being a bit overshadowed by what Matthews is doing, and Mitch Marner is all over the place, including playing part of one of their last games on the defensive end, which is kind of impressive in its own right. You maybe don't want a forward that you're spending $11 million on playing defense, so that's something that hopefully they've gotten addressed with the addition of Lyubushkin, but either way, it's been an impressive run here for the Leafs, and now, as always, the question will be whether or not they can continue this into the postseason. Which actually, speaking of the postseason for the Leafs, while it is still a month and a half away, this next week could be a very interesting week to watch for the Leafs in particular, because it seems more and more likely as time goes on that their first round opponent is probably going to be the Boston Bruins, and their last 2 matchups with the Bruins this season are 2 of their next 3 games, each happening here in the next week. And that brings us to the top 3 teams, where I do feel like there's at least a little bit of a gap between these top 3 and the rest of the pack. Starting off in the 3rd place with a team that I honestly don't know why I had them as low as I did in the last week's power rankings, so this was a bit of an adjustment to move them up here into the 3rd spot. It's the Winnipeg Jets, who have been fantastic over the last 3 weeks, winners of 9 of their last 11 games, and although one of those losses did come this last week, this is a team that seems to have rebounded from a tough stretch there and to really get back rolling like they were midway through the season. So even in spite of that 4-1 loss to the Stars that I already mentioned, which really affected the Stars more than the Jets in this power rankings, I was able to forgive the Jets a bit for that loss since they did win each of their other 3 games this week in regulation and fairly convincingly over first the Blues 4-2, who are battling for a playoff spot of their own, so that wasn't a pushover by any stretch of the imagination, then the Hurricanes, who we just saw a couple places ago, and then the Sabres 5-3, which, yeah, I mean, the Sabres have been not amazing this season, but they too are still trying to keep their distant playoff hopes alive and have been playing a little bit better here of late. And just to add to those impressive wins, especially that one against the Canes, which, like I said when I was talking about them, they overcame a 3-0 deficit with 5 goals in the third period to end up winning that game. They also are doing a lot of this without too much production from Kyle Connor in his return, as he's still taking a little bit of time to knock the rust off. Now, he did score one of the goals, in fact, I think the first one in that third period comeback against the Canes, but just as was the case when Connor was out of the lineup, they're still getting production from all up and down it, which certainly, again, is, I would say, confidence-inspiring going into the postseason, where you never know, well, for one, who could end up getting injured, but also who you're going to need to step up in any given game. And of course, the place where you need players to step up the most in the postseason is in net, and they continue to get great goaltending from mostly Hellebuck, but also Brossoit, when now just about every third game he ends up getting a start so that they can give Hellebuck a little bit more rest and not put it all on him down the stretch going into the postseason, where you'd have to imagine it pretty much will be all on him unless things don't go well for a game. Then they can always go to Brossoit, considering he has been very good when he gets his starts. As we move on, though, that of course brings us to the top 2 teams, which as soon as I say who's in second by process of elimination, you'll probably know who's in first. But in the second spot, dropping to the second spot thanks to a 4-3 shootout loss to the Leafs, it is the New York Rangers, who, if they had won that game, I probably would have kept in first. But the other team that jumps them now into the first place did have a perfect week, and the Rangers, this is now their second loss in 3 games, so they have to move down a spot even with this strong season. So for the Rangers, in spite of losing the top spot in these power rankings, at least for now anyway, they have already come back to retake that once, so maybe they could do it again. But this is still a team that has not much of anything to worry about because of that 10-game here that they went on before losing 2 of the last 3 games. Even with how well Carolina's been playing, they reestablished a pretty good foundation to put themselves in a good spot to end up winning their division and getting one of those top seeds going into the Eastern Conference playoffs. Now, even still, it might be worth pointing out that if you buy into advanced stats, especially the 5-on-5 advanced stats with the Rangers, they do point to them potentially having overachieved a bit this season, as they're under league average at both 5-on-5 offensively and defensively when it comes to expected goals for and against. Now, a lot of that is made up for by great finishing. Obviously, Shesterkin helps a lot at that end of the ice, and they are a top 10 team when it comes to shooting percentage. Not quite to the same degree as, say, Vancouver has been this season, but still a team that's gotten their fair share of luck and been able to finish with some high danger chances. Not to mention that special teams, when they're not at 5-on-5, they're fantastic as well. 6th best on the power play and 4th best on the penalty kill. So all that does help, but all I'm saying is that it might be something to watch, even with some of their players like Artemi Panarin having career seasons. And that then leaves, in the first spot, finally earning their way here, the Florida Panthers. For the Panthers, it has been an impressive last couple of months. Winners also of 9 of their last 10, including 3 shutouts in that time. They did get shut out in their 1 loss, but 3 shutouts for themselves. And a team that right now looks like the team to beat in the NHL by all accounts. Like the Rangers, they're doing very well in special teams, both on the kill and power play. 5th best on the power play, 6th best on the kill. They too are getting very good goaltending, as those 3 shutouts in the last 10 games would suggest. Bobrovsky, in fact, I'd say the only reason he's not the front runner for the Vezina is Hellebuck has kind of run away with that conversation. Still, it's an incredible season for him, as he finally seems to be earning that contract that he maybe has been underperforming for a few seasons now, but at least this season has very much been playing up to that contract and how he played in the postseason last year on that run to the Cup final where they just came up a few games short. This season, though, they're definitely trending in the right direction going into the playoffs, at least a month and a half away. And on top of all that, unlike the Rangers, who still have been getting the results, which is really all that matters, when it comes to those advanced stats and the 5-on-5 expected goals for and against, the Panthers are one of the best teams in the NHL in both. They're second only to the Hurricanes defensively, and offensively they play 6th, just behind the Hurricanes and a few other teams, with the Oilers far and away in first. With really the only place the Panthers have been struggling, not just recently but all season long, has been with their offensive finish and a shooting percentage that is very much towards the bottom of the league. Even there, though, you could point there to maybe some bad luck and a potential regression to the mean that could mean they score even more and could be even better than they currently are. As always, though, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below, who your top 10 teams would be, what teams you think I got too high, too low, or maybe there's a team that I left off this list entirely or video entirely that you think deserves to be here. Otherwise, until next week, or if you're here for the R&Rs, the back-to-back games for the Kraken coming up here on Monday and Tuesday, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken! Which I only say as a force of habit. The Kraken aren't anywhere near this top 10 and are pretty unlikely to be in it unless they win the rest of the games this season. Maybe next year, though.